Hi, Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you here today. I always like to pass the interview back to my guest and give them some quick opportunity to introduce themselves to the listening and watching audience about who they are and what they do.
I'm Scott Flynn, and I'm the author of Outpouring. And I unexpectedly found myself in this place. When I look back, I think I'm not supposed to be here, but here I am in this space of spirituality. And that's what makes my story so unique. Just like everybody else, it's no more special than anybody else's on this planet. But when you allow life to unfold how it's supposed to, it gets really interesting and leaves you in states of awe.
Yeah, I'm excited to uncover that story with you here in this interview. The second question is, the inception of this podcast started because I left my religion of origin. I went on a spiritual journey and found myself in other modalities and teachings that really resonated with who I was as a person. So I'm always curious about where everyone starts off. Like, did you have a religious experience? Were you plunked into anything? And then how did you find yourself on this path of spirituality and awakening?
Yeah, so I was brought up in the Catholic religion. At an early age, I would say 7 or 8, we started going to church because my parents were both raised Catholic. My dad was in Catholic school growing up, and my mom was in and out of Catholic school as they moved around the world. And so they brought their 2 kids up in it. And as a young boy, you're very open to hearing what is going on. And what I heard Jesus saying to me was our love and to share that love. If I was going to wrap up what I heard prior to 10 years old, it would be in those 2 sentences. You are loved and share it. But as the indoctrination went on and the catechisms I was going to, the hypocrisy started to creep in, and the dogma and the rhetoric, and I was almost like wanting to raise my hand, like, hold on, this isn't what he's saying. Right? This is way too complicated. Like, it's way simpler than this. And so as I was in my mid-teens to late teens, I just said, I'm done. I'm out of here. This isn't working for me.
Yeah.
And at the time, because I didn't know the difference, I threw both Jesus out with the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I made my mistake, because I didn't know any better. Later on, which was just about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a preacher came into my life via YouTube by the name of Marshall Davis and said, Scott, you had it all right. Where you got it wrong is you associated Jesus with the church.
Mm-hmm.
You can throw away the church, but keep him. And it's not that I went back into the church by any means, because what I just described to you actually came into my knowledge. I could say while I had progressed down the spiritual path quite a bit, right? I had to get over what I call the Jesus hurdle. Like, I knew eventually I would have to confront that relationship I had with Jesus in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, through Marshall, he allowed me to see it clearly. And where this really goes is that all great religions point to this, right? All great religions point to that there's one reality, there's one God, there's one substance, there's one. And whatever that one is the truth. And so this is just another confirmation that when you discover who and what the one is, everything meshes together. Like, it all falls into place.
Mm-hmm.
That was my upbringing. And then between my late 20s and late 40s, there was no religion. There was no spirituality. I was just a guy living life until life fell apart. And that's when I had to start, you could say, looking behind the curtain, like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And seeking the truth. And in that seeking is when an acquaintance at the time, who is now a very good friend, set a book in my lap and said, Scott, I think you might be interested in this. And it was a book on non-duality. And it was a very short book. You could read it easily over the weekend. And as I read it, I didn't have any idea of what it was saying. I couldn't get it. Yet I kept turning the page. And something within said, whatever this is, it's important. And you need to keep turning the page. And I did.
That's
And
interesting.
yeah, it was, when I reflected back on it, there was a knowing within me that wanted to further to know itself.
Or like a remembering.
Exactly.
An eternal remembering when you're
Yes.
getting in touch with this information. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a very common experience.
Yeah, it was an internal whisper, you could say, of saying, you need to figure out what this book is trying to say. Which led me to another book, which leads to the videos, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah. Yeah, you're pulling strings, and then all of these synchronicities happen. And if you have a curious mind, which it sounds like you do, you start to just follow your curiosity to this deep and beautiful knowing of getting in touch with that eternal knowing, which I think is really beautiful. So you wrote this really beautiful book called Love Outpouring. On the first pages, it talks about the old idea of know thyself. I actually have this tattooed on myself. In Sanskrit when I started my journey. So I thought it was very humorous, and reason why I wanted you on the show was like, oh, this feels like a synchronicity, because as soon as I started my spiritual journey, the first question I had was like, who am I if I'm not all these things that my family has conditioned me as? I also grew up in a very cultic version of Catholicism. Who am I if I'm not these ideas about what a woman is supposed to be, and where does my intelligence fit in all of that? So I'd really love if you could tell the audience about the concept of the book, but then I want to ask you some specific questions about the book itself. But and it's also very much in alignment with what you said about non-duality and trying to understand that for yourself. But how did you put this book together, and like, what is your intention putting it out into the world?
Let's first define non-duality. Because if your listeners are anybody like I was, I would have had no clue.
Okay, well, there's mostly advanced spiritual people, so they've probably heard of this. Yeah, you're in very good company. We've discussed non-duality a lot on this show, so definitely define it for anyone who might not know it. But I just want you to feel comfortable to speak at whatever pace and understanding you have in this moment, and know that the audience will be with you.
Wonderful. That is very comforting. Okay, so non-duality is the English word for the Indian philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, where Advaita literally means not two, so it's non-dual. And then Vedanta is a philosophy, you could say. It's actually the scriptures at the end of the Vedas, but you could say it's a philosophy. So Advaita Vedanta is a philosophy of non-duality, or a philosophy of oneness. And Advaita states that there's only one reality here. And we can put all sorts of different words on reality. We could call it yourself, or God, or awareness, consciousness. And it says that yourself, this one reality, is the home of permanent peace and happiness and love. So if you know that one reality, which is none other than yourself, you will know all of these amazing qualities that we're all running around the world so ferociously trying to find or discover or become or experience. And so the trick here in the West is applying value to awareness or to yourself, because we could ask anybody, are you aware? I'm like, yeah, but so what? But that doesn't mean anything. What do I do with that? And it's a very valid point, because nowhere over here, I want to say over here, the West versus the East, is it ever introduced to us that this is a possibility of what you're looking for. Like, absolutely nothing. Nowhere.
Yeah, there's no pointers here. And I think that for me is embedded in, because in the Western world, a lot of our systems are built on Christianity and the patriarchy. It creates that division inherently, then takes us away from ourselves.
This is about discovering or rediscovering what has true value in this life, and then turning your attention to that and hanging out in that, because that is permanence itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is where it gets really profound, is that this one substance is awareness. So Advaita says, out of this one non-conceptual, non-objective substance, all of creation comes out of that. All of the universe and the material world comes out of no thing. And so this one thing of awareness, since I am here in this world, I have to have it in me or access to it, right? And that is in realizing that I am aware.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could go on to ask yourself, give me an example of when you have not been aware. And any example that you attempt always has an awareness of that experience.
Right.
So we're aware in the waking state, we're aware in the dream state, right? Because we're aware of our dream.
Mm-hmm.
We're aware in the sleeping state. And this is where it starts to get more profound as you go deeper into these different experiences. People say, what do you mean? I'm asleep. I wasn't there. Well, what knew if you had a good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep? What heard the alarm clock when it went off? Mm-hmm. What was aware that there was this slight gap or a gap between dreaming and waking? Awareness.
Mm-hmm.
What about if you have a out-of-body experience or a near-death experience? You go off into these beautiful realms that we all hear about. What was aware of that? You, awareness. What if you take large doses of psychedelics and you get catapulted into the atmosphere and the galaxies? What's aware of that? What if you black out due to drinking too much? What was aware that you were blacked out? It's inescapable. Your awareness is inescapable. That is the truth. That is the one substance here, and it's permanently here. Mm-hmm. That's why you hear in this message a lot that you can experience permanent peace, permanent happiness, permanent love. It's because awareness is permanence itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you talk about it in the book quite a bit, that or I think you preface it at the beginning of saying, wherever you're going on this journey, whenever you pick up this book, you're looking for something, you're not going to find it, because all of this sort of exists inside of ourselves. I think a lot of people get confused when they have what I would say that first contact with their being aware of their awareness, which is very nuanced, because like you said, it is always there, but we're not always conscious of it. And so it's interesting to think about coming into contact with that awareness for the first time and thinking, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I think sometimes your ego gets attached to doing and being, trying to figure out that answer of how do I cultivate more of this awareness? And that can even take you further away from the awareness itself, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. The term enlightenment or self-realization is when awareness becomes aware of itself. Mm-hmm. Just to your point, when you become aware of your awareness, mm-hmm. right? So when awareness becomes conscious of its own existence,
yes,
is self-realization. You're like, oh, I am it. It's right here. It's I am is awareness. I am is the answer I seek. Mm-hmm. It's prior to simple.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's prior to your mind.
It's really interesting to have that experience for the first time. I think even, growing up in my experience, even contemplative practices in my Christian upbringing, it pointed me towards something outside of myself. So I couldn't really engage with that awareness until I came out of it in a different way. I did want to ask you, in terms of this, keeping in line with this idea of self-realization, from your perspective in writing this book, you talk about it a lot, about the challenges, about the positive things that we can experience with self-realization. For you, what did you find in your journey that there were roadblocks to your own self-realization or other people's self-realization?
It goes almost back to the first book I read, right? Which means that we're going to hit a roadblock in this path. And that roadblock is, I'm not who I am, or this this message is saying I'm something different than who I am. And that can kind of send a little shock through you, if not some fear, because it's like, well, then who am I, or what am I? Like, am I going to disappear? Am I living the incorrect life?
And there's grief there too, realizing you're not those things.
Yeah. So that and self-doubt are the two biggest hurdles. Self-doubt with a capital S, meaning that yourself can't be the answer.
Right.
The ego, the mind is going to say, that's not it. It's too simple. What are you going to do if I'm not here? Who's going to get up every day and do this life if me, the ego, the person that's done this life so far, isn't here anymore? And it does a pretty good job at scaring you at first, or at least it can.
Yeah.
But if you stay curious and you keep peeking behind the next curtain, you'll realize the more peeking and curtains that you look behind, you start to become comfortable with this and go, oh, this does appear to be the answer. Like, I'm heading in the right direction.
Yeah.
So it took me suffering.
That was going to be one of my questions for you too. I was really curious for you to explain to the audience, like, there is pain and suffering, psychological pain, and maybe even physical pain for some people. This process is painful to go through. I really was curious for you if you'd like to share what those were for you, and how did you move through that?
So I say that there's two reasons that somebody comes to this message, and they both end up in the same place, which is yourself. You're a truth seeker. You want to know how this all works. You want to know the truth, and you want to experience it. And the other one, which is more likely, is that you experience so much suffering in your life that you'll say you'll do anything it takes to be happy again.
Yes.
And that's where I was. So I, at the time in 2008, was a home builder, and the market crashed, as we all remember, and values vanished, and bankruptcy was, everybody was going bankrupt or out of business. And I was pretty new to being an entrepreneur at the time. And my conditioning was that you don't lose money, you count every cent, don't risk money, right? So when I started losing money, it just ripped the fabric of who I was in half. And I just went into like a tailspin of depression at the time, because I just didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand how I could look at a house and have it be worth $500,000 one day, and a year later it's worth $280,000. It just didn't work. I didn't get it. And why I had to pay to build this house, and now I have to write a check at closing to get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
So it was pretty devastating times for the bulk of the country and the world. But in that tailspin, I found myself in a dark place that I'd never imagined could be. And so it was years of trying to dig out of this hole through. And this is where the list of everything you can try comes into play, right? I am over-the-counter prescriptions from your psychiatrist, talk therapy, neurology. I tried meditation, different types of meditation, mindfulness, transcendental meditation, large doses of psychedelics, and
you did all the things.
I did it all. Microdosed psilocybin. And we can't deny that it doesn't work temporarily. But when you've reached that bottom, to get underneath that fear and anxiety, nothing would touch it.
Yeah.
It's like it was always still there in the background, no matter how well that procedure worked, whatever it is I was trying. That's when non-duality came into my life, is when I was in the midst of that. And over the course of about 4 or 5 years in it, I realized that this was the only answer to experience a life of permanence again, of permanent contentment. Because
I love me some contentment. Contentment and peace, I didn't realize were my end game. And then on this journey, I found them, and I will, like, they're priceless to me.
They're everything. They're the only thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. My business partner has a shirt that says, if it costs me my peace, it's too expensive.
That's exactly right.
And if you live by that, your life is going to be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And how you can help others in that process of you just being yourself and at peace with yourself.
I ask you just one follow-up question here. I'm really curious about, from an egoic standpoint, thank you so much also for going into the detail of the pain and the literal suffering that you would have endured during that time. I know a lot of people went through that. I want to highlight this because I think a lot of people, when they go on a spiritual journey, like the egoic association we have with our financial stability, whenever that's disrupted, that rocks our world huge. And like, it doesn't matter if you make six figures or, $50,000 or $1 million, like, it's hard to not have your ego align with that as who you are. And I was wondering if you could say more about that and how, like, you had to disconnect that piece of it for you as well to sort of be like, well, I'm not this $500,000 home. I'm not all of these accolades that are coming through financial means and things like that. What was that like for you? I'm really curious.
That's the fabric that we're all conditioned in our society.
Yeah.
We unconsciously get woven a fabric that we're unaware of until it gets ripped, right? And this fabric is your identity without even knowing it's your identity.
That's right.
Right? Because in that financial collapse, there was integrity on the line. There was responsibility on the line. There was who I thought I was on the line. And I didn't want to lose that identity that I thought that I was. And it was in that tailspin, and this is where it gets really interesting. When I was at the bottom, you might call it the dark night of the soul. I had no idea what that was at the time. And I rarely use that term, but most of us will understand that.
Yes.
That if I would have looked to the void, looked to the emptiness, and saw that there was nothing there except the presence of myself, that probably would have been my awakening.
Yeah.
But I held on to the idea of a false sense, like I'm going to dig myself out of this hole because I'm the guy that goes out there and gets stuff done. That's who I am. And so I went on a journey to heal myself instead of realizing that if I just would have turned back to the emptiness and see that all that is there is myself. Oh boy, that would have changed things.
Yeah, how strange to know that point and to think that you didn't pivot. It's almost like that old philosophy saying of sitting in the cave and not looking back.
And again, if we would have had any sort of schooling or education on this possibility, if you're ever there, you'd be like, oh, maybe I could turn this way to just see if this is the answer. And
or
this
you're
goes
even understanding, having acceptance in that moment, like accepting what is, right? Because it's the resistance that didn't allow you to turn around and see in that dark seat, in that dark moment of the soul, that like you could surrender. I really don't like that word because it sounds like you're giving up, but it really is about, like you said, accepting as if you'd accepted it in that moment, you could have been in that same place, maybe differently, but
absolutely. I was as close to self-realization that I'd ever been.
Yeah.
Up to that point. It was right there.
Yeah. So let's pivot to the good things on the self-realization path and your path of curating a book that you probably didn't know was your book at the time, but this creation of Love Outpouring, because there were a lot of really good things, I think, that you encountered on that. So let's talk about those. Like what did you find on your journey of self-realization that was positive, that you feel are important for us to, cultivate on that journey?
Yeah, so when I first came into the message, I came into what is known as Neo-Advaita. It's like a watered down, it's a shallow version.
Okay.
And I spent years in there trying to figure it out, and it made me frustrated, if anything. And then I was listening to, sounds like you understand that.
I do. Well, and I think also like you're very intelligent. You have an engineering degree, I feel like I don't like generalizations, but I think when we are academic or see the world in a very like literal and a process way, I'm very much like that too. I really empathize with that because I was having those same experiences where I'm wanting to understand it from like an intellectual academic standpoint, and you can't reach it that way.
Fortunately, about 3 or 4 years after that book came out, I heard Rupert Spira talking on a video. And it's not like that was the first time I encountered him. I'd been encountering him for probably 2 years prior to that. But I didn't have the maturity, right? Because I blindly got dropped into this to hear what he was saying. But as I matured, there was a time where I'm like, wait, what did you just say? That went in again. And so the more I listened to Rupert, the more he brought in love and peace and these qualities that Neo-Advaita just doesn't discuss. And I was like, this is it. And the more I listened to him and the more that he had examples for everything. Like he was never short an answer of explaining how this one reality works. And so in that, when I was listening to him and in this message, I became quieter. I became sane. And it was really profound. I'm like, that's when I knew like I had found the right message within this message. And that's Advaita Vedanta. And then he was talking about a practice by the name of self-inquiry that you could, and this is where it starts to get counterintuitive, you could make an apparent effort to know yourself. And once I heard that, I'm like, hold on, I'm a guy that gets shit done. Wait, there's something I can do? Because Neo-Advaita said, no, this is it. You can't do anything. This is all there is right here. And so then I was again kind of off to the races again, still suffering, still like in fear and anxiety. But about a year and a half after spending time with him and another speaker of this, Michael James, who talks specifically about Ramana Maharshi's teachings, was when I realized that the answer is surrender into myself via self-inquiry. That's where the true clarity and the healing will come from. Because you can exhaust the conceptual knowledge of this all day long. You're like, I get it. I can talk about it. I can write about it if I want. But I want to experience it. I truly want to know myself. At the time, shut down a business, and I told my wife, I'm dropping out. I'm surrendering, and we're going to have to figure this out because I am not a happy person, and you know that. And my negative radiation has been affecting us for 10, 15 years. And this is it. And I've got to do this. I'm gonna so-called save my life. And it was about 2.5 years ago now that I surrendered myself, my limited egoic person that I thought that I was, into the higher infinite self, my being.
Yeah, big S self.
Big, yes. And that's when the true healing came into play. That's when the clarity came into play, like, oh, I'm experiencing what the sages have talked about in books over the last 10,000 years. The clarity comes into play, the experience of peace, like you're moving concepts of peace and happiness and love into experiences of those. And to your point earlier, I love to use the words contentment and peace. Contentment is probably the one. There's just total contentment regardless of what is going on in my life.
Exactly. Yes, it's number one for sure. Yeah, a lot of people go on the spiritual path seeking happiness, and then you realize that's, fleeting. Contentment is deep and eternal and forever, and can help you weather this very heavy, complicated experience of being a human being. Yeah. Contentment is everything.
And the message is so simple. This is where the mind says it can't be this.
Yeah.
All this message says is if you're going to turn within and self-inquiry is turning your attention away from the world and onto yourself, right? You're turning away from the objective world, and anything that you know with your mind is an object. So your thoughts are an object, your images and ideas. Anything you know with your body, your emotions, your feelings, your perceptions, the world, that's all objects. You're turning your attention away from that and onto yourself. So there's only one job now that the ego has to do, if the ego's willing to do it, because it takes courage to do this. When the ego turns its attention back onto itself to rediscover the love of itself, that's all it has to do. It just has to turn and hold its attention onto self as relentlessly as possible. And from there, self heals from the inside out. So it starts to carry all the burdens. You do the work of remembering, and it will do everything else.
Yeah. You said something back there that on my spiritual journey, I met this man named Flint Sparks, who is a Buddhist monk, and he has this whole dynamic that he talks about, which is called growing up and waking up, and it talks about the spiritual maturity, but also the mental maturity. When you come into contact with these ideas and these thoughts that you feel resonant, but you can't quite understand them, and how important it is for everyone on this journey to recognize that those things happen like this, like it's a ladder where we're sort of meeting, our maturity and our awakening or self-awareness, whatever you want to call it. They're sort of moving in parallel to each other, and sometimes one is ahead of the other. And I think it's so important that you mentioned that, because, and I want to underline it because it's a huge part of this process. And I wanted to ask you too specifically about the healing from this perspective of your journey, but also from the male perspective. The listening and watching audience is predominantly women, but 30% is about men aged from 35 to 65, which I think is really interesting, because that's when men start to have historically the awakening, the midlife crisis, the sort of the dark night of the soul. So for you, speaking directly to the men listening to this podcast, that healing is a huge component to this as well, right? Because you're undoing all of the garbage that you grew up with. You might be healing parts of yourself that you didn't even know needed healing. I'm really curious for you, what did you encounter in your healing journey in this process, whatever you're comfortable telling and sharing with the listening audience? And then how did it change you? What did it help you, how did it help you become who you are sitting in front of me today?
Yeah. Great question. So in the letting go process, you're letting go of all of your identities and attributes that you believed yourself to be. And some of them are easier than others, right? For instance, it's easy for me to say, even though I ride bikes, I can say I'm not a biker, I'm not a cyclist. That's that. But when you start to get into identities such as I am not a son, I am not a father, I am not a husband, it starts to get intense. It can get intense because those are extremely strong identities. You could go on to say, I am not a man, right? So when you encounter this is where, when you're inside, you understand, by letting that go, everything you let go actually comes closer to you. Now you're intimate with and as those things you let go, right? So by me letting go of saying I'm not a father, which is probably the biggest identity.
I'm sure that's hard.
What's realized is my children came as close as they've ever been. And so the way to look at it is, now there's fathering is happening. Husbanding is happening. Soning is happening. Brothering is happening. Everything that once used to be a cold, solid noun, I'm over here and my child is over there, and there's distance between us, now becomes one verb. Now I'm verbing with my children, with my friends, with the world. There's no more distance anymore between me and other. There's only the one experiencing itself as this. The other piece for males is like masculinity, right? We're
that's
talking
huge.
about peace and love here. That's not manly. But the thing is, it's extremely manly, because this is not saying that you become weak, that you can't be the warrior when it's time to be a warrior.
Mm-hmm.
When you know yourself, all there is clarity. So whatever situation you're in, you're as clear as you can be to experience that, and you can say act on that or serve that is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
And if your situation is to have to, you could say, fight, if you're in a war or a brawl, you're going to serve that experience. I mean, this goes right back to one of the greatest spiritual texts is the Bhagavad Gita.
Mm-hmm.
It takes place on a massive war field, a battle zone, because, the first 3 chapters are the war within. There's a battle going on in here. And so far, the negative side is winning, but now you're going to bring that back to the positive side.
Mm-hmm. And like awareness, the peace and the love exists there already inside of the masculine form. It's always been there. It's about coming into contact with it in a different way.
Absolutely. It's about, when you're not doing whatever it is you're doing, the mind, if it's not busy, it's agitated in silence.
Yeah.
That's why when we're done doing a task, we sit back, we want to relax, but then the mind goes like, oh, I need to go do that next thing. Mm-hmm. Why? Because it can't stand silence. Your egoic mind does not exist here and now. So this is saying, as you come out of your warriorness and settle back, you're as peace now as you were when you were serving whatever it is you were serving in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, we're getting towards the end here, so I want to ask one more question and get into the wrap up. One of the questions I had reading through the book too, and just all of the information inside of it, was you talk about your own progress in this whole. I don't know how long it was to do this whole book, or when you started writing it versus like when your spiritual experience started and all of that. But I wondered, in terms of tenacity and being able to have like commitment to this process, because it can be very confusing sometimes. It can be hard. There can be times when you don't really know if it's worth it. Staying the course. I want to ask you about staying the course of it. Like, what do you have to say for people who are sort of like at the beginning of where you were a few years ago? Like, how do they stay the course in all of it, and stay committed to this understanding and trying to really rid themselves of the things that I think our society pushes on us, which is like living a very egoic life, pretending that we're separate from everybody, pretending that we don't have shared humanity and we should care about the collective. All of those things.
Yes, this definitely is an individual journey into the collective. Mm-hmm. This goes back to my earlier point. The only way to have true change in your life where you are experiencing it as yourself is to turn your attention within. You have to get in there. You have to start exploring what self is relative to everything other than yourself. And this is where the sages in this message have been saying for thousands of years. If you do that, they promise you will experience the positive benefits of it. And this is where all 8 billion of us have access to this through I am. I am is your tether back home to yourself. When I surrendered into self and exploring myself, that's when the clarity came about, and that's when the book started to be written. So the book is written from the, you could say, real-time experience of self-realization. So things I was noticing that were changing, some of them might seem kind of silly, but the first ones were, I had books on my nightstand that I wanted to know and understand for years, like the Tao Te Ching is an
I love that
example.
book. Yeah.
And I picked that up for years to try to get it, and I thought I was, cool because it was by my bed. But one day I picked it up, and I'm like, I understand. So there's an understanding that happens when you tap into this, and then you go back and read the master's writings. You're like, I understand. Things change in your life that you know that you didn't put an effort into. For instance, like if somebody cuts you off at a stoplight or a red light, before you'd be like, dang it. But now you'd go, dang it. And the more that you turn within, dang it. And then nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That is peace.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and then the overall message, it just, regardless of what is happening in your life, it's all okay doing whatever it is it's doing.
Yeah.
That contentment.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to leave it there for now. But where can everyone pick up your book? Do you have any book events coming up? Where are you on social media? How can people connect with you?
Yes, my book just launched to the United States and Europe this week. So Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, any place where you'd buy a book. I have a YouTube channel at Love Outpouring. I've got over 250 videos on there that help people along with the process. And my website, loveoutpouring.com. I have free one-on-one sessions with people from around the world. I do my best to meet people where they are and help them along in the process, because there's nothing more than that I want than for you to know yourself. I know if we all knew ourselves, this place would be completely different, as you know. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out. You can email me. My contact information is on my website if you've got questions, or book a one-on-one with me. And some people just show up once, and some people come back 4 or 5, 6 times until they don't need me or the message anymore, because they know they are the message.
Yeah. It's all inside of us, which is really beautiful and profound once you realize that.
Yes.
Well, I like to wrap up with some gratitude and kind of just keep it light here at the end and check in with my guest about any 3 things that they're grateful for, anything rattling around in their heart chakra before we end this interview.
One of the main reasons I wrote the book is for my love and gratitude for the people, the sages, the cultures that brought and keep this knowledge alive. Every time I'm with it, every time I'm talking to somebody about it, reading about it, sitting with myself, it just leaves me in awe that there's this huge body of knowledge that we have we have access to it, but it's not brought into our life. And so I'm just left with love and gratitude for the message and the knowledge and the culture that has helped to set me free.
Beautiful. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you today, Scott, and reading your book and being able to highlight this journey that you've been on and the work that you're doing. It's really important. And people listening to the show and watching it on YouTube, they are always constantly looking for more perspectives on this journey. And so I'm sure your book will be a nice addition to their reading list. So thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Krista. I enjoyed our time together.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.